mode.
Welcome everyone to QuestaWeb's webinar titled Think Like a CEO to Justify Your GTM Solution Acquisition. I wanted to thank everyone for registering and attending today's event. We have quite a few attending and we are looking forward to a great presentation. Today's webinar is about teaching you how to communicate with the C-level to bring GTM technology to your company. Some important topics we will cover are cost savings, risk reduction, return on investment, and how to greenlight this important investment. The takeaways from this webinar will include an understanding of critical success factors when justifying a GTM solution, how to present a realistic proposal for the effort and costs that involve implementing a GTM solution, and what value a GTM solution brings to your organization. We will set aside 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for anyone to ask questions via chat messaging. On your control panel on your right, you will notice a box titled Questions. Below it is a box reading Type Questions Here. Feel free to type in your questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to get to them all by the end of the presentation. I'm Wayne Slossberg, Senior Vice President here at QuestaWeb, headquartered in Clark, New Jersey. QuestaWeb is a provider of global trade management solutions for importers, exporters, and foreign trade zone operators. Let me say up front that this webinar is not about QuestaWeb and its products. In fact, this will be the only mention of the company and its GTM solutions. Let's begin with our first poll question, which I think will be very interesting and enlightening. Have you ever tried to convince the C-suite to purchase the GTM software? Yes or no? Please respond now by selecting your answer and submitting it. Interesting. 41% of you have tried and 59% of you have not. So it looks like today's seminar is going to be very interesting and productive. Okay, let's go one step farther with our next poll question. Were you successful in convincing the C-suite? Please respond yes or no, and by selecting your answer and submitting it. Okay, 25% of you were successful. Actually, that's very good. 75% no, and maybe that's what we can help you get that end result that you're looking for today. So, well, it looks like our polls support the fact that GTM technology acquisition is both a relevant topic and one where this webinar may be able to help many in today's that are attending today. Our speaker today is Beth, the president of BPE Global. Here are some background about Beth's company. It is a consulting firm that helps clients develop GTM strategies. Oh, hold on a second. Be right back. Had a little glitch there. Okay. Okay. So, as I was saying, our speaker today is Beth, the president of BPE Global. Here is some background about Beth's company. It is a consulting firm that helps clients develop GTM strategies. The company is known for its extensive knowledge about global trade compliance. Her clients are in many industries, including aerospace, defense, consumer products, energy, financial, healthcare, high-tech, and telecommunications, just to name a few. Beth has 25 years experience in global trade compliance and international logistics. She is an expert in import-export operations, compliance, and global supply chain security. She is also a frequent writer, speaker, and educator. In other words, Beth is both knowledgeable and qualified to present today's webinar. I am both proud and pleased to have her with us today, so without further delay, I'd like to welcome Beth and ask her a question. Beth, you have been conducting benchmarking with American Shipper for over 5 years. What's going on with GTM?
Thank you, Wayne, for that sweet introduction. I really appreciate it. We've got a little picture of our study up here. So we have found that there's been a steady increase in the number of respondents who are using GTM-specific technology to manage their operations. So that increase has come as the number of respondents using hybrid kitchen sink approach has decreased from 43% in 2012 to barely more than a quarter this year. Meanwhile, the number of companies handling things in a manual fashion, remember that's not chisels and tablets, it's relying on spreadsheets and email, that number has actually held steady. And this is good news overall. Just shy of 45% of the respondents indicate that they have a single import and export management platform that's not Excel, compared to 33% just 2 years ago. So the key will be transitioning that group of manual importers and exporters, generally 1 in 5 respondents, over the course of this benchmarking study to a systems-based approach. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to launch another poll right now. And so let's ask this question. What is driving your decision to implement a GTM solution? So pick every one that applies, and we'll wait for the results. Okay, let's see if we can get the results up there. Cost savings is always the biggest driver, so that's not unexpected there. Growth is a very logical reason, and more than half of the respondents suggest that they're selecting GTM solutions for growth. 63, so very close to cost savings. People are looking at risk mitigation when they implement a GTM solution, and then only 33% are looking at a government requirement or probably a consent decree or some kind of a fine or a penalty that's requiring them to do it. And I'd love to learn more about the others. Maybe we'll get some suggestions in your questions. So I'll pass it back to Wayne.
Okay. Beth, when I'm talking with companies about GTM solutions, I have found 2 things to be absolutely true. First, managers and directors who are involved in importing and exporting on a day-to-day level understand the need for GTM software. They also understand how time-consuming it is to prepare documents manually and the high likelihood of errors. When mistakes happen, they can be costly, especially as CBP gets involved. What is one of the biggest barriers that companies face when it comes to acquiring GTM solutions?
So those companies who say they haven't invested in import-export management technology, they cite 2 primary reasons. The first is a lack of funding and internal resources, which is very real. And then the second is a lack of visibility into the return on investment from such technology. So it's really incumbent upon import and export compliance systems providers to clearly spell out that return on investment from their products. But the reality is many importers and exporters just don't have systems due to lack of budget. So those companies that may want a system, but other IT projects take priority, that's another reason. And unfortunately, it often takes a compliance or operational failure and subsequent penalties or bottom line hits to motivate the company to invest in import-export technology. It's a problem many organizations face. Supply chain often takes a backseat to sales and marketing. But we're seeing that that attitude is changing but it clearly manifests itself in organizations that don't carve out a budget to automate processes like import and export compliance that are cumbersome and fraught with inaccuracies. Another barrier to acquiring a GTM solution is budget. It's super critical to measure your operation today. How many people do you have? What do you spend on outside solutions providers, service providers? How many team members do you have? And then figure out if there's any return on investment that you'll gain by implementing a solution. So that way you can make financial sense out of your request for a GTM solution. So to really understand these costs, I recommend that you engage with your financial department, talk to one of the financial analysts, and identify what the spend is between internal headcount, external outside sourcing of headcount, investment of systems, and then figure out what it's going to take to, if you bring in a GTM solution, if it's not only just justified, but it's a common sense decision. So a really good driver of this would be growth, like we saw in the poll earlier. So some ROIs we've just seen are increased duty avoidance, decreased taxes, reduced inventory carrying costs, reduced headcount, and I'm really, really cautious when I say reduced headcount because I think it's even better to say that the headcount can stop working on tactical initiatives like classification and immediate just-in-time type things and can focus on more strategic initiatives so that they can reduce cycle time overall and increase sales.
So that's what your survey says. And now, any other insights, Beth?
Well, hands down, it's a lack of understanding of the value of global trade compliance. So let's face it, most senior management doesn't have a grasp on what global trade compliance is and why it's important. There aren't any business schools that train leaders on trade compliance, so it's up to trade compliance practitioners to provide that lesson to their management. So the other day I was speaking to a group of trade practitioners on metrics, and I asked how many of them knew their corporate goals. And when just a few hands went up, I was absolutely, completely shocked because I'm a firm believer. If you know your corporate goals, you can tie what your global trade compliance initiatives are directly to those goals. And when you communicate to your C-suite, to your executive management, you should be communicating how you're meeting corporate goals, not how you're meeting your trade compliance goals. And that's a different language that many trade practitioners need to learn how to do. So problem is those people who didn't raise their hands understanding what their corporate goals are, they're probably the same people that just couldn't justify a GTM solution. So again, speak the language of the boardroom so you can be able to get the attention of your leadership. So we're going to ask another poll right now. Speaking the language of the boardroom will often depend on who makes technology decisions in your company. So let's ask who you have to convince. Please respond now. Select one of the above: CEO, CIO, CFO, or COO. And then we'll give you a second to respond. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're keeping you moving through this webinar. That's our goal. Now we'll go ahead and look for the responses. Wow, okay, so it looks pretty evenly split between the CEO, CFO, so the decision maker and the money approver, and then it's interesting, we're seeing this trend happen a lot more lately. The CIO is often very involved in making a decision whether GTM is acquired or not. We've actually had companies where the CIO has signed a deal for GTM and told the trade compliance department after the fact. So 1 in 4 GTM deals are being signed off by the CEO. That's interesting. And then COO, still, even though trade compliance directly affects the operations of the company, only 14% are involved in approving GTM acquisition. So Wayne, I'll let you take it from here.
Well, Beth, can you give us an example of really what you mean?
Well, sure. If you walk into a meeting with the IT project approval team and say something like, we need a GTM solution because it's against the law to sell our products to embargo countries, they're probably going to yawn and not understand anything that you're saying because it's really not something that's important. They might be fairly savvy and just say, oh, we can use our ERP system and we can block those countries in that system, so you really don't need a GTM solution. So I'm suggesting you change the way you communicate when you're in those approval cycles. And so if you say something like, we need a GTM solution so we can accelerate our shipments and make our quarter-end numbers, the team's going to actually ask you to expand on that. They're going to want to know exactly how you can make the company a better, bigger, more successful company.
So what are some of the other examples of how companies justify their GTM solutions?
So we've seen some really interesting examples in recent time, and they might not be as obvious as you would think. So one company was actually refinancing some of their debt, and they were going through what they thought was a financial exercise. So they fill out all the loan application information, they check all the boxes, they turn it into the lender, and what really shocked them was that the lender came back and said, you have to have a GTM solution to do screening as a condition of getting this loan. So here's a company that knew nothing about global trade compliance, didn't have a dedicated resource for global trade compliance, and then all of a sudden, for them to pay a lower interest rate, they have to get up to speed on global trade compliance. So that was a really interesting one. We had another example where a company was acquiring another company, and they had a trade compliance department. They know how to comply, and they were great. But the company that they were acquiring did significantly more transactions than they did. And so although they had a very solid, educated, expert trade compliance team, they realized to onboard the company that they were acquiring that they would need a systematic approach to bringing that company on board and ensuring the controls. Even if they made the decision that, hey, we can take our beautiful program, our trade compliance program, and teach the company we're acquiring why it's important to comply with global trade compliance regulations, the reality is they just couldn't teach enough people and physically, manually screen and create documents and process shipments in a way that would be effective. In fact, they would never make their quarter-end numbers. So a condition of that transaction of acquiring the company required the acquiree to actually get a GTM solution, which was really interesting because the company that did the buying, they really had been wanting a GTM solution for a long, long time. So when you hear that your company is thinking of going on an acquisition strategy, please open your ears up, because that might be a real good opportunity for you to finally get your GTM solution that you want. Another example of a company that was able to acquire a GTM solution is they were seeing the licensing process to process shipments add several days, if not weeks, to the transaction. And they were losing sales. They were actually, to non-U.S. companies, they could not fulfill orders in a very timely manner. By getting an automated GTM solution, they were able to program their product master with all the licensing rules and requirements, so it didn't have to go through a bunch of email chains, through to the supply chain, through to the trade compliance team, back to the supply chain, back to sales. They were able to immediately trigger a license requirement and start the license application. And so that really, really helped. And taking it back to what I was just saying, it helps them meet their corporate goals, which is sales, and to attain a certain level of sales without losing sales to the competition because it took too long. So just another key to succeeding at justifying your GTM solution, it's really important, is you tie your project to another internal project that's being championed by one of your executives. So we've seen examples where a CFO project is designed to keep costs down, and then GTM becomes a cornerstone of that project because GTM is going to keep costs down by not having to hire additional headcount. We've also seen examples where a company just didn't have the ability to determine eligibility and qualify and then ultimately certify their products for free trade agreements, but when they automated the process, they were able to do that in pretty quick instant. They were also able to push that process up the supply chain to purchasing. So when purchasing was acquiring specific commodities to build into their products, they could also get the vendors that they were acquiring products from to issue certificates of origin so that they could claim preferential trade agreements. There's many reasons why you can get an ROI, but what I find in a lot of cases is companies just fail to calculate the ROI. They get an opportunity to buy a GTM solution and they forget to calculate what their current ROI is and what it is when they finally get the approval. And Wayne, I'm going to talk just a little bit more. One type of project that we see a lot of in companies that global trade compliance should be jumping on immediately are ERP implementations. So think about it. You're rolling in a massive ERP system. You're implementing a customer master. That's the perfect time to start thinking about screening. You're implementing an item master. That's the perfect time to think about product attributes like classification, other government agency requirements, anti-dumping flags, things like that. And then when you implement the actual orders and shipment functionality, you're right in there with trade compliance documentation, making sure you've got your destination control statement, your ECCN, your HTS on your documents. So don't get depressed when you hear that your company's rolling out an ERP system. Walk down to IT and join the band so that you can get trade compliance attributes included in the ERP implementation.
Incredibly interesting, really very interesting. Let's say you get the go-ahead for a GTM solution. What's next?
So this is another one of my soapboxes that I get up and stand on, and I really want to hope that if anybody takes away something like this from right now, it's you don't call the vendors right away. So the vendors don't know your business. The vendors aren't in a position to write your RFP. You need to sit back and you need to think about what you want. So too many people go straight to the vendors and start asking for pricing. And I really want to reinforce that's a big no-no, because the vendors aren't going to be able to give you accurate pricing because you haven't given them any information. So deep breath, super critical that you take the time up front to plan how certain steps are going to be automated and all the scenarios that will result from a change. So a change in process is not just about deciding whether to send the information in a spreadsheet or a database or EDI or link it to a more sophisticated tool. The change in process is really, where do we get our data? How does our data come to us? How can we transform that data in a way that has a better usage within the system, not just replicating existing things? So a big deal of determining your business requirements is all around the timing of when to send information, how changes to what information is being sent should be communicated, what you're expecting. In fact, this is a common mistake. People send data, but they don't ask for a response back saying the data was received, and you end up with broken pipes and data going places that people can't get to it. So very important to make sure, what do I expect as far as responses? How quickly do I expect business partners who receive the data to react to that data? How often do I expect content to be updated so that my content stays nice and current within the GTM solution? And then walking through everything you do within your business process and determining what other elements also need to be considered. So I do multiple process design meetings where you meet internally with your team and your team comes up with what they think the idea is, and then you expand that group a little bit more so that you're talking to people who would work with your department, so other departments like purchasing, like sales, like marketing, and ask them what they could see the system doing for them, what they need from the system. And then don't stop at your own four walls. It's really important. You do business as a global trade compliance person, probably the majority of your business with people outside your operation, your service providers, your freight forwarders, your customs brokers, the people who write your bonds. There's lots of people that should be involved and help design the to-be process that you want to have for when you implement a global trade management solution. And I really spend a lot of time building the relationships with these people, responding, identifying where there could be, gaps in information and seeing if you can fill them. And then another really important process that has to happen is the design throughout all the steps, and then you want to think of what's going to happen for contingencies. What happens if a shipment is not released? What happens if a item isn't classified? What happens if it turns out a license is required? So all of those types of things should be discussed well before you actually call the vendor.
That makes absolutely great sense. So what comes next after that, Beth?
So I think it's really important for shippers to decide what systems they want to use. So how integrated do they want the solution to be with their systems? Do they just want to send a file so that they can do denied party screening and get the results back? Or do they want a fully end-to-end integrated solution? So would that solution include an integration to product data, an integration to party data? What's the system of record for each of those master sets of data? Would the solution include receiving purchase order or sales order data and then shipment order data? And what happens when there's a variance between those two? Would those solutions create your documents, or would you rely on your ERP systems to create your documents? So you really need to sit down and think about what systems you're going to want to use, and that's also going to determine who you talk to as far as a vendor. If you're looking for a very simple process to be solved, then you can look at certain vendors who specialize in that type of process. And it's really, really important that you also think about how these vendors are going to train you once you've gone live on it. So the trade team knows exactly what they want and what they're going to get from the GTM solution. But I think it's really important to include as part of your roadmap what you're going to do to train every player in your trade compliance ecosystem so that you can make sure that everybody's getting the best out of that system. So you want to look at who will likely be the players who are impacted by process automation. So it's important not just to train those with responsibility to import and update data. It's also those who might be impacted by holds or delays, and those who will have to review or approve responsibilities.
Beth, there are cases where we get a request for a quote, an RFP, but the RFP doesn't include a lot of detail, or the opposite occurs. The RFP is very redundant. This makes it very challenging to providers like us to do an accurate quote or RFP. What do you recommend?
Yeah, so if I was in your shoes, Wayne, I would create a workshop for that client to really talk through their business process, since they chose not to give you a great deal of information. But what I'd like to even suggest that you don't have to get involved in that. I would like to suggest that the global trade practitioners own that responsibility of writing a comprehensive request for a proposal. So one of the key milestones of that is to go through the various elements of what should be included in an RFP. So your requirements of what the software should do based on the needs of the trade compliance and all the stakeholders, and what they'll use in that solution. So you always have to include very, very, very detailed requirements on what you want the system to do. So for example, you can't just say you wanted to do denied party screening. You should also talk about embargoes. You should talk about items that are restricted or that are identified as items that need to be held, and that you cannot approve or deny the transaction. You need to block the transaction. You need to talk about what countries you're going to be operating in and what regulations you are subject to, so that the solution is not just US-centric. You need to also include a section of your RFP that will help the solutions providers provide quotes. And this, I have to say, is probably the biggest part that is left off of RFPs. So you want to tell them volumes, like how many users are there going to be on each module. You want to provide the number of transactions. And when I talk about transactions, I'm talking about orders, entries, the number of items. How many items are you going to have, or part numbers are you going to have in your customer master database? And I can tell you, a lot of people don't even know how many they have, how many actually ship, how many are foreign versus domestic. How many harmonized tariff schedule systems? How many HTS numbers will you have? How many ECCN numbers do you have? Do you have one EIN that you export under? That's your exporter identification number. Or do you export under multiple EINs? The same with importing. How many importer of record numbers do you have? Or do you have multiple importer of records, so you need to have multiple versions of the system for each location that is importing? So if documents are required, you need to tell the solutions providers what languages are needed and for which countries. And the vendors also will need a list of the importing and exporting countries for content purposes. So if you're considering restricted party screening, you'll want to provide the number of vendors, customers, and employees that will be screened on a recurring basis. I've even pointed out that people need to make sure that they are very clear on stating that they want an automated screening function as well as a manual screening function, and get down to the level of detail that you want to have an audit trail for those screening activities. You should also include all the systems that you're going to integrate to with the software. So those systems might include your ERP. It could be a CRM or customer relationship management tool. It could be a document or reporting software or other proprietary databases. If you're going to get the best out of a GTM solution, you'll want to integrate it to all the systems you use to hold trade compliance content or do trade compliance processes. So you also want to think about what systems you're going to connect to outside of your company. So are you going to be able to connect to your transportation, warehousing, or logistics management systems? So it just, don't cheapen out yourself. Don't short sell yourself on building your RFP. You absolutely need to make the investment so that your vendors that you're targeting and asking for a quote from can give you an accurate quote.
This is great information, Beth. We've seen examples where a company received an implementation quote and a project quickly exceeds the quote. What can companies do to keep this from happening?
So I'd say most implementations run the risk of going overtime and costing more than anticipated. And one of those biggest issues is content. So the phrase garbage in, garbage out cannot be truer when it comes to automation of trade compliance processes. So as a shipper prepares to automate, or even if they already use systems for the day-to-day processes, it's critically important to have clear understanding of where the data elements reside, such as what is the system of record for each element, who owns those data elements, who has access to change or update them, and at what point in the overall timeline they are created and modified. So I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Content management is a massive undertaking, but it's also a key success factor in the evolution towards automation. If you don't have clean content, you're going to end up paying more than you expected to get it clean because your system just isn't going to work. So many companies intend to implement an outsourced solution without considering what those changes require internally to make the implementation successful. So for a GTM example, the customer master setup and process often needs to be evaluated as this data feeds into the screening and licensing part of the GTM solution. And we found cases, in the majority of cases, where companies commonly have messy customer service records. So no data governance practices used by the order management team. And it's not because they're trying to make bad data, it's because they haven't been given rules. And so when they set up a customer in the ERP system that requires names and addresses, they can put the names and addresses in the wrong place. So we've gone in and seen, okay, we want to screen the parties in a transaction, but the parties are written in a flex field as opposed to written on the name field. So trying to map to what name to screen is a bit of a challenge. So they have to go back in and redo their entire customer master. We've also found massive mistakes on countries inputted with two-digit ISO codes, so people often make a mistake and may say North Korea instead of South Korea, and then they abbreviate names or fail to spell it out, so many data elements in the country field tend to be a problem. So often there are thousands of such records that need to be reviewed and corrected before pushing data across to the GTM solution. And so, the solution is just not going to work until you get that fixed. One more example is requirements definition. So let's say you didn't give it your all when you filled out the RFP, and you didn't know what you really wanted during the implementation. So it gets drawn out, and the GTM solution provider is trying to get to the bottom of things. So again, I really consider it an essential element of getting a GTM solution to do a thorough job of defining your requirements prior to engaging a GTM solutions vendor.
So Beth, what other things should companies consider regarding the cost of implementation of a GTM solution?
Well, and I can guarantee you, many people never consider the fact that the preparation for automating compliance activities may actually become a full-time job in addition to that resource's existing full-time job for a period of time. So you figure you got to pay the vendor for the software and for the implementation, but you don't realize that the person you have internally to your own company that needs to do their real job day to day can't do a full-time job on top of, adding the GTM implementation. So you got to factor that cost in. And so companies intending to implement a GTM solution just must plan ahead, make sure that the schedule of the implementation is done so it doesn't overlap with peak periods as possible. And we should have thought about that for this webinar. It's quarter end right now, so you don't want to run up against quarter end and year end. You also want to make sure that you delineate backups for the team leader just in case they win the lottery.
Thanks so much, Beth. Any last thoughts?
You know me, Wayne, you can't get me to stop talking. So the reality is that the reality is that GTM solutions provide so much functionality that companies just don't realize that they will need multiple phases to complete their GTM implementations and fully leverage all of the capability in the purchase systems. So in other words, when you start down the GTM automation road, you really, really, really want to understand that that first implementation you did might just be a fraction of the functionality that you could take from that system. So it's common to see shippers with a global GTM solution only implement something like restricted party screening for one business rather than across all of its business units globally. So implementing a truly global GTM solution is a long-term process, but far too often that process is initiated and never fully rolled out. So when you're planning your rollout, do it multi-phase, and focus on the development of a business-wide global strategy with committed resources to utilize every function available within that solution.
Beth, I have to tell you, just an excellent presentation, and I thank you so much. I see our audience has some great questions waiting for us, so let's now turn our attention to them. Our first attendee asks, is automation important in conducting your day-to-day global trade?
So the reality is, at least in this day and age, automation is so impossible. Doing global trade is impossible without automation. The amount of data that we face on a day-to-day basis is massive. And so I'm a big advocate of global trade automation. I'm also a big advocate of developing that ROI so you know what is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck.
Great. Okay, here's another question. I think that's a very, very good question. Is it important to have a GTM system that has that's centralized?
Well, okay, so I'm of two minds on this. I'm a control freak. I, of course, would love to have everything coming through my one system and make sure that I see and control everything. But the reality is we're global businesses, and we operate on many levels in many regions in many countries. And the reality is that implementing a really, bells and whistles global trade management solution in every aspect of your operation may not be realistic. So I am seeing more commonly now than in the past, I'm seeing more of a hybrid solution. So one GTM solution connecting to another that was already in place in Europe, connecting to a TMS solution in Asia, with the goal that your global trade management solution collects the data and the metrics on your global operations so that you can have that, and I'll use the word dashboard, but you can have that global view of what your people are actually doing and where your risk is.
I think you're really going to like this question, Beth. What specific points do I need to include in my justification GTM technology?
So it always goes back, what's your corporate objectives? And so I would look at those, and if your corporate objective is to reduce cost, you can put things like duty avoidance or float if you move to ACH, Automated Clearinghouse, for those people who don't know that acronym. So again, what does your company want? And come up with ways that GTM automation can help your company. And if you don't start at that level, it's going to be an uphill battle. But then I also think it's really important to always have an element of brand protection. If we get it wrong, our brand name could be put at risk. I think it's also really important to talk about risk mitigation. So if we were to have a breach in a country that could impact our sales into that country, what would that mean to us? There's been a recent example with ZTE. They were put on the denied parties list, especially designated list, and the reality is many, many companies are their clients, and if they were put on that list and kept on that list, those people wouldn't be able to make their products. So luckily we got a little bit of a stay of execution on that, and we're able to still ship to them under a general license. So again, taking risks as a global company can really impact your bottom line, so I would include things like that. And then I think it's really important to talk about headcount efficiencies, and too many trade compliance practitioners forget to talk about inventory carrying costs. If you have goods that stop moving at any point in your supply chain because of trade compliance, then something's wrong. Our global economy is set up to keep things moving through customs, so you're failing to get some information to a person that needs it to be able to help keep your goods moving. So I'd look at all those things, but again, start with your corporate objectives.
That's great. Well, that's basically all the time we have today for questions. I want to really thank you, Beth. You've been great. I'd like to thank everyone for attending our first webinar on GTM technology. I hope it's just the first of many more to come. I'd like to end the webinar with one final poll, and that is, did you find today's webinar helpful? Yes or no? Please select your answer. So thank you for responding. You've been a great audience. Looking forward to another webinar with you, and goodbye for now.
Thanks so much, Wayne.
You're welcome.